Good morning and welcome to the Brazil Summit. My name is Paulo Vieira da Cunha. I'm one of the directors of the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce, and we are delighted that you could come today. I would like to express our thanks to White & Case. This is a beautiful facility, and we will hear soon from John Viterli in his welcoming remarks.
Well, just a couple of words because I'm sure we all want to get to the substance of these terrific panels, but on behalf of White & Case, welcome to our Quorum conference facility. It's a delight to have you all here, and it's always a delight to partner on a continuous basis with the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce, which has really established this yearly event as the premier Brazil economic event in terms of market leading and late breaking information and actionable advice to those of us who are interested in this incredibly important economy of Brazil.
So good morning. Thank you all for coming. Amazing venue. White & Case, congrats. The Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce, fantastic initiative to have here and put the subject of Brazilian agribusiness in one of the panels. Agribusiness is funding option. I was talking about when we were just putting together the panel, I think of what is a key component for Brazilian agribusiness. Agribusiness growth is the funding option. That's has been key for the sector, and that's what we've seen most, a big number of foreign large financial institutions, funds, family offices now being dedicated to see what we have, available for business in Brazil. Brazil is a global commodity powerhouse. We are leader in exports of soybeans, corn, sugar, coffee, meat. So it represents every year $170 billion in exports. Every year we have a renewed flow of hard currency funds into Brazil of the size of $170 billion US dollars. That's a big inflow of funds. There's a big opportunity. So as a lawyer that we tend to work with foreign lenders, we see generally just a fraction of this $170 billion being, I would say, target by foreign lenders in order to do business in Brazil. And when I see, generally, foreign lenders, they focus more on the top tier, the tier 1 or tier 2, because they have more transparency to look at the risk. So what we see export prepayments, we see direct lending, we see receivables program that's now becoming very popular in Brazil. And we see all of these three mixed with sustainable and green loans. Also, one of the funding options is equity. Sometimes it could be in venture capital, sometimes it could be in private equity, sometimes it could be in mergers and acquisitions, and also commercial partnerships or relationships. That's what we see being targeted, a fraction of this 170 billion. So one of the points I want to talk with the panelists is let's talk a little bit about the good news. As we are there in the war front, what we see, a material improvement in collateral instruments. We see the new Brazilian ag law, where some of the complaints of foreign lenders was that, okay, I have a loan and I have to enforce the loan, but I go to court and I cannot get back my money. So there's been an improvement in collateral, in security package for lenders. That's good news. Second, that's a big one, digitalization. So Brazil is generally an early adopter of digitalization. So we see now all the contract, the promissory notes, the collateral instruments, most of them being digitalized or signed electronically. That's it creates a faster structuring of these transactions. The third point is capital markets. Brazil has, I think, made a decision that the public banks are not enough to finance Brazilian agribusiness. We see the size of the need for financing. So there was a creation on top of the foreign lending structures that I talked before. We saw some of the FIAGROs, which is agribusiness dedicated fund, has grown substantially. Now we have around $5 billion already dedicated for a fund created just 3 years ago, over 100 funds already in place. And the agribusiness receivable certificate, just as an example, now having $25 billion already in offerings. And it's a structure where it can be a dollar-denominated or euro-denominated sort of bond linked to receivables from Brazilian agribusiness.
So Brazil is definitely facing a lot of headwinds right now, right? So we have a lot of farmer bankruptcies, weather, no, but that's the only thing that we really cannot control, and pricing pressure. We have seen that a lot. But on the other hand, for long-term investors, Brazil is. I always say that Brazil is the Saudi Arabia of the agribusiness, right? So as Lucy, yeah. No, as you mentioned before, the big export of sugar, grains in general, coffee, orange juice. You didn't mention that one. We also the second exporters of cotton and ethanol. So there's a lot of opportunities there. From the grain side, on the grain side, Brazil basically went from, I have here my numbers, around 50 million in the 1980s, and today we're producing over 300 million tons of grains. So, within 40 years, Brazil grew by that size, and also the recent biofuel bill and higher blend mandates on ethanol and biodiesel. I think that's if you look in the long term, this is another opportunity, and that's what we try to focus. Low carbon emission targets. All these will play a big role for investors that want to be in Brazil for the long term. But as Lucio mentioned, Brazil is not for amateurs. You need to understand the business, obviously, structure that you put in place. You need to have a presence in Brazil. So you need to have flexibility in Brazil, I would say. You need sometimes time. I think the legal system does work in Brazil when compared to other Latin American jurisdictions, but you need good lawyers.
I think it's a very good moment for agri to access sustainable finance in general. What we've seen with the sustainable finance market was a natural emergence in the more, let's say, obvious sectors with energy, and then moving slowly into transportation, urban mobility, and so on. And agriculture has almost been one of the last to enter that space. Not in Brazil, actually. The first ever green bond done out of Brazil was from the food industry. And it's always been quite a different picture when we look at the global picture of sustainable finance, and then we look at Brazil and Latin America, and it's predominantly about the agri and forestry story, notably with some leadership from the pulp and paper companies since 2017. But I think, going back to your question, Lucio, when we look at the global demand and appetite, be it in capital markets from investors, be it from lenders in the sustainable finance space, there's a lot of appetite for diversification around sectors. So there is genuine appetite and interest to further understand what are the credentials of sustainable agribusiness, what information and what performance enhancements that a certain borrower or lender can give both to us as lenders, but also in the capital market space. And I think there's, it's almost unprecedented of how technologically advanced the Brazilian agribusiness is. And, drawing a lot on the expertise from Embrapa, which has very good proxies and calculations for all of the production techniques, I think there has been still to this day a bit of a gap in communication and how we bring that to the market with adequate, information and disclosure around some of the key characteristics. Because there's to the Saudi Arabia analogy, I think Brazil specifically has one of the biggest potentials for sustainable finance globally, and that's largely connected to agro and forestry.
Look, I think it's just supply and demand issue, right? I think there was data I was reviewing yesterday, actually, that over the past 2 years, private credit has doubled in agribusiness in Brazil, and it pretty much has overtaken public funding. So the government via Plano Safra is now, a third or a fourth of what it needs to be to provide funding to a lot of these smaller producers, even the bigger producers. So look, there's definitely interest. There's definitely, lenders out there in private credit and commercial banks that are interested in funding. I think it's an issue of cost. So a lot of times, especially in my business on the U.S. side, I wish there would be more bonds in the international capital markets. The reason we've seen such, so few is primarily because of the cost issue. But I think, over time that will change. It really depends on interest rates and the market. And we do see that interest on the green side, on the sustainable side. We have seen a couple loans in that space. So, we hope that grows more and more. But at the end of the day, I think it's just an issue of cost and whether the companies are ready to, go into the U.S. market and assume that cost.
And Rogério, just I want to go back to you, is that when I see in Brazil, as I said, war front, where you see companies, like top tier companies, they have availability, they have sophistication to access the international markets. They come to New York, they go to London, they talk to Chinese lenders. But the middle markets, like companies that have annual revenue of $200 million to $1 billion. I see that these companies, that they are profitable, they have a very good market share, they're ready to access funding in US dollars, but they don't have connection, they don't have expertise, they don't have even English language, right? So from your perspective, as I know that you've been there in the market for a long time, which commodities or which type of companies, when you access Brazil, you are looking for? What's your target type of company? If you can just share with us this.
What kind of companies we target? Exporters, right? Because you're dollar finance, so you don't want to take the Brazilian real risk. And I'm talking about the debt funds here. Of course, in the equity, I think there are plenty of opportunities. When we talk about agribusiness, people forget to talk about logistics, right? And that's a major issue and also an opportunity in Brazil. So Brazil is the lowest cost producer. It ends up not exporting even more because of logistics, right? It's just very, very expensive and not efficient at all. So exporters, so this is number one. Now you mentioned some of the commodities that we invest in because they are dollarized, and I think that's what most of the banks and funds are looking for, at least now from outside Brazil.
You are looking to Brazil, and you have an office in Brazil. You have a big office here, I think, nearby. What sectors? If you don't want to talk about like what type of size or so, get into the details because of some internal restrictions. But what you share when you are looking to Brazil, like in the coming months or coming days, what you are targeting?
Sure. I think
for green finance, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So if I can just make a comment, I think to Rogério's point, which is really, really critical, and especially when we talk about sustainable finance and we look at agri across the supply chain, it's not limited to production, right? It's yes, production, but it also goes through the tradings, it goes to logistics and distribution. And I think that's a really critical piece, because in a number of commodities in Brazil, you see the bulk of the emissions actually coming from distribution, from logistics, coming from other things other than production. So I think, if we take soybean in Mato Grosso, for example, cost of distribution is about a third. Emissions it's close to about 40% of the life cycle emissions of producing soybean there. So I think when we look at Brazil, in terms of financing, it's definitely linked to trade finance. So it is, as John was mentioning earlier, I think capital markets is something that we see, I think, in a little bit more of a cyclical way because of the points that were outlined here by both of them. But on the loan space, especially within the trade finance instruments, is it export finance, other types of prepayments, guarantees, LCs, so on. I think that's where the biggest potential will lie. And also, I think there are types of instruments that the local sector is also more accustomed to because of the histories that we've outlined. What I wanted to highlight on sustainable finance is where we are today in the ecosystem of sustainable finance solutions. We can work with pretty much any instrument in its different capacities, right? And obviously subject to the assets and the performance of the borrower. So right now we have use of proceeds, which is your typical green loans, sustainable loans, where we're financing assets that bring a substantial contribution, mostly directed at climate change. So we're looking at things like the low carbon Plano ABC, the low carbon agriculture techniques that are funded and responsible for almost 200 megatons of reduced emissions just in the last year in Brazil. That's your labeled green loans that we would be able to apply to a number of those loan products. The other bucket of solutions that we have at our disposal are the sustainability-linked loans, which you mentioned, Lucio, earlier. These are connected to the borrower's performance. So one of the things that would be looked at is how that borrower is able to enhance performance, particularly from an environmental standpoint and an emission standpoint over time and over the duration of the loan or whatever the product that is being structured is. So to conclude in terms of what we're seeing, and when we look at transactions in Brazil, we're looking at what are the most material subjects, traceability of the soft commodities, deforestation or assurances, safeguards around deforestation, and I would say increasingly looking at biodiversity as well. And I think we have an ample knowledge base to be able to share that information, and some players that are performing very, very well in that sector. I think it's making that connection to the market.
Think about these transactions, and we, as lawyers, we need to think about like structure and help and put together the structure.
Yep.
What type of legal structures you see from your U.S. standpoint now being placed in agribusiness? And if you could just pinpoint some key points of attention that lenders or investors should have once to look into potential structures.
Yeah, no. So I mean, on the loan side, what we see typically is obviously there is collateral, so there are secured deals. On the New York side, we would see an assignment of receivables. We would see an account pledge. And on the Brazil side, you could see a host of other collateral instruments. You could see potentially a mortgage, or what's called a alienação fiduciária, or fiduciary assignment of property, real assets. You could see a pledge of shares. So you could, in Brazil, you could get pretty creative on how you structure these loans, essentially to give that certainty on foreclosure and execution. So that's what we've seen recently, and obviously we've done, pre-export or export prepayment agreements as well. They have, an account, a pledge of accounts and a receivables assignment as well. And that's what we typically see. On the international capital market side, on the bond side, when we've done bonds, they've typically been unsecured. But these are larger companies with better corporate governance, more transparency. So what'll typically happen is the syndicate of banks will be focused on, how does the corporate governance work, deforestation issues, sustainability issues. Those are real, what we call risk factors in the document. But those companies that are larger do end up getting or have the ability to do unsecured deals. And they have, restrictive covenant package, which we call high yield, that restricts them from doing several things, particularly, restricted payments, or, paying dividends to shareholders, it's limited, etc. So those are the structures we typically see, and emphasizing the part of diligence. I think that's important. A lot of the investors and bondholders on the debt side that are looking at these transactions, in addition to the collateral, they are looking at transparency and making sure that they understand what the risks are, especially with the deforestation and some of the issues around land acquisition and moving indigenous populations and those kinds of things. So as lawyers, we end up looking at both the structure but also the diligence part of it, which is important.
Yeah. So thank you very much for the panelists, and thank you for staying with us, at least for this first panel. We have the following panel, which is going to be fantastic on economics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good morning again. We had a wonderful discussion on agribusiness just a little bit ago. And now we are going to turn to the second part of the summit, which looks at the broader macroeconomic and political outlook for Brazil. As you probably know, you've been following recent developments. Brazil continues to defy some more pessimistic expectations. We all expected 2024 to begin on a much slower and difficult trajectory that was already foreseen in the last quarter of 2023. But here we are yet again. Revisions for growth are being revised not downwards but upwards. There are, of course, some concerns with the management of the macro economy, particularly on the fiscal side. It seems that despite all the valiant efforts of Minister Haddad, the administration still is of the mindset that there is no problem that cannot be solved with greater public spending and ever creative way to increase the revenue side to support that public spending. We now have a Congress that is fully embraced on that philosophy. So clearly the fiscal accounts are continuously under pressure. And there are also, of course, challenges on the global side that affect Brazil, not least of which the continued trend of a very strong dollar that kind of is depressing global output everywhere else.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here again. And the chamber has always treated me very nicely, so thank you for that. Well, it's interesting to talk about Brazil, particularly about this week. I'm going to go back to DC. I'm based in DC tonight, and as you know, this week's going to be a very intense week there, talking about Brazil in a dozen situations. But I think that the thing that I see year after year, I have been talking in the events in DC for the past I don't know, 12 years. And one of the things that I notice is that every year the entire goal is to manage expectations. And Brazil is a country that one of the major gaps between what's happening and investors and those that somehow deal with the country is managing expectations and managing frustrations. It's a country that the bandwidth in which things become good and bad is perhaps a little bit larger than the bandwidth that people are used in relation to other countries. So the variations are higher. But one of the things that I always try to bring is that even within chaos, there is some sort of organization going on. And this organization is something that can be identified specifically when you start looking at the players and the actors and not necessarily the institutions. Because the power of decision-making travels much faster through the players that sometimes have no correlation whatsoever with the position that they are occupying, but they are able to enable a decision, to validate a decision, block a decision, or even transforming an entire goal or direction from the government. It's also very interesting to focus and to remember that Brazil is a parliamentary country disguised as a presidentialist country. The entire attempt of the creation of the 1988 Constitution was aimed at having a parliamentary system in which we had this very unusual event, which was the referendum to decide our system in 1993, in which monarchy even got 14%, which is also something very different. But since then, the construction of the relationship has always tended to strengthen Congress in relation to the executive, to the point that in the last 8 years, perhaps, the Congress is becoming much, much more powerful than the executive. The decision-making process from the Congress is not limited to the boundaries of Congress itself. The decision-making has already surpassed this, and the major drawings and designs that are made by the Ministry of Economy, by the Ministry of the Civil House, and other areas of the government, they must have a direct participation of players from the Congress, or else they will end up either boycotting or changing everything once it gets there. So understanding this dynamic is very interesting to understand that Brazil, the decisions, even though they appear to begin in the executive, you have the Congress participating on it. And the last and ultimate voice of decision-making lies with the Congress. Well, because of that, we have tensions as we speak between the executive and the Congress. And these tensions, they are fully understandable because they have completely different goals and different objectives in the short and the medium term, specifically eyeing the elections that we're going to have towards the end of the year. This stirs up the Congress, and it stirs up the Congress mainly when it's related to budget. Because the individual that has the power to manage this budget or to suggest the direction of this budget, he inherits a huge political power to be used in several other areas that will strengthen his position politically. So the recent tensions that have emerged again between the executive and the Congress is highlighted among two individuals, the Minister of Institutional Relations, Padilha, and the Speaker of the House, Arthur Lira. The relationship between the two is very hard and complex because first they're speaking different languages with different goals and objectives. It's part of Padilha's role to challenge the Congress and to push forward with as aggressive as he can the relationship with Congress. However, Lira, the all-powerful Speaker of the House right now, he's not very interested in dealing directly with the presidential palace because he has already a good relationship going on, even though it's not 100% guaranteed that whatever they talk or discuss is going to be agreed upon. But he has a good relationship going on with the Minister of Economy, Haddad. So this changes a little bit the decision which Haddad enjoys a more powerful relationship with Congress in comparison to the specific areas within the presidential palace that are supposed to enhance and improve the relationship with Congress?
I think it's important to compare Brazil. I mean, to look at relative terms. Even this complicated political agenda that Thiago just described, I was just thinking while he was outlining all the details, the agenda for this year, comparing where we were a year ago. We had come from the most polarized election in history, very tight results, just after January 8th, events, invasion in Congress. We had this big event from the Lojas Americanas, huge concern about credit markets in Brazil. Everyone was very negative with growth performance. And then we started, I think that already by April last year, we already had the early signs that 2023 was going to be a better year, at least in terms of economic growth. Agriculture, the topic of the previous panel, definitely had an outstanding year that supported a lot the economic performance of the country. Also, on the fiscal agenda, we had approved the constitution amendment at the end of 22, which allowed the market huge concerns about what would be the policy direction of the new government after they allowed a deficit of over 2% of GDP. And there was this concern on explosive trajectory for that GDP dynamics. And I think that when you look at this perspective, we are definitely in a much better shape this year than we were last year. Even in terms of Congress agenda, we did evolve with a fiscal framework that, in my view, is not enough to stabilize debt to GDP, but definitely something enough to guarantee, to write off the negative tail risks that the market was pricing and was fearing at the beginning of last year. Also, when you look at Brazil in terms of growth performance, we did start the year more optimistic on growth, and we kept being surprised with the earlier numbers of 2024. We do expect GDP already at 2.2% this year, a little bit above the consensus. And there are a few factors that would justify little bit more constructive on the relative terms. There are, I fully agree with Paulo. When you look at long-term GDP performance, especially per capita growth, definitely a concern. But structurally, Brazil is very well positioned with the recent geopolitical trends, all this deglobalization or fragmentation that definitely is inflationary for the rest of the world, can benefit Brazil as being an important and secure source of commodity, especially for food security, energy security, and even metal and miners. That does give us a lot of opportunities, I would say, at least when you look for more medium to long-term growth. And then on the cyclical side, you look at the balance sheet of the private sector. There was an important increase in terms of savings. The balance sheets of the companies do look very positive in terms of leveraging the banking sector as well, and even the households that's indebtedness. That was a huge concern that we had at the end during 2023. It did seem you can see some early signs of improvement with the reduction of interest rates and especially the strength of labor markets and real income growth. That, of course, came at expense. Private savings are higher because public savings are much lower. The deficit was very high at the end of last year. But this outperformance of growth, especially driven by agriculture last year, also allow inflation to be much lower than everyone was expecting. It was a positive supply shock, and that was extremely helpful for real income growth, but also it was a positive open room for the central bank to be one of the earliest ones in the world to start cutting rates in a very gradual, cautious mode, and they are evolving to that.
When you look at the price action, when you look at the prices, what international investors think about Brazil debt, right? The conclusion that you get is that something is off compared to, say, what Cassiana has mentioned, which is very much what I agree with, right? As opposed to the previous monetary policy cycles that tended to be deep and somehow uncorrelated with the external backdrop, U.S. rates, right? What we see in the current cycle is exactly the opposite, right? A relatively shallow cycle compared to 2015 or whatever other cycle you want to see. A market that apparently learned to forecast the central bank way better than it used to, at least during cutting cycles. The market always doubted what the central bank was going to do. And what we see now is almost like a better position investors, maybe because they learned about the bias, I don't know. And third, and most important in my point of view, is like an increase in the correlation between the perceptions about the cycle and the external backdrop, right? US rates used to not matter much to Brazil rates, and now they seem to be the primary factor. Question that I have in mind, and I don't have an answer, is that because of fundamental reasons? Is the Brazilian economy fundamentally more open? Or is it mostly due to like a technical reason, positioning? My gut feeling is that it's more like the second than the first. Microstructure of the Brazilian market has changed. And there is an opportunity there, you know, in fading this correlation, so to speak. I think like there is a lot of premium built in the Brazilian curve, especially in the very front end. And it's yet to be seen if this premium is going to materialize or not. I don't think it will. Further back the curve, of course, there is like all these concerns that my colleagues here have raised, fiscal, political noise, yada, yada, yada. We can kind of like make up a lot of stories. And I think they're right in a lot of what they say. But, you know, in markets, it's very hard to disentangle what drives, right? I mean, we see something and we claim it's something else. I think like the key point here, as I said, is what's going to happen, how will the central bank actually react to a possible delay in the US cycle, right? And how that's going to fit into the prices. I think this is the key question here, right? Of course, like all these concerns regarding internal affairs in Brazil are, you know, of course they don't help, right? But I think like in a different world where the Fed would be delivering 3-4 cuts this year, all these concerns would be forgiven. You know what I mean? And Brazil would be the paradise to receive rates, like it's always been during cutting cycles. So it's yet to see. If you ask my opinion, I think the market is wrong. Okay, and I think like this risk that we're seeing, especially in the very front end, will not materialize.
So, you know, first of all, and I know most people would know that, but our energy matrix is extremely clean, right? 80% of the energy Brazil produces are clean energy, right? It comes from hydro or wind or solar. And particularly winds and solar, which is the chart to my right. Yeah, it shows how much it has grown over the past several years. And it's already 30% of our matrix is basically wind and solar energy. And in the report, if you look in the report, we have detailed analysis on why is that, right? So I don't know if you know, but whoever does kite surfing knows that in the Rio Grande do Norte area, in the northeast of the country, the wind is the most powerful in the globe, right? So that's one of the reasons why we produce so much wind energy. Also, I think Cassiana mentioned that about biofuels. and how important that is for the country too. So Brazil today is the second largest producer of ethanol, and has been growing production just behind the U.S. And today, and this is not really that much into the future, right? Today, 21% of our transportation matrix is fueled with biofuels already, right? So it's not something that is going to happen, it's happening. And we show also on the right side a chart showing the carbon footprint of the different type of vehicles. And I think one good thing about biofuels is that we don't have to reinvent the infrastructure, right? It's the same infrastructure that we use today to fuel our cars with gasoline. We do the same with ethanol, right? So we don't have to make a massive investment in redoing the whole infrastructure to be able to benefit from that. And as you can see in the chart, ethanol cars in Brazil, they can be very efficient from a carbon footprint point of view. Also, and Cassiana mentioned that too, Brazil is by far the largest net exporter of food, right? But by far, I mean, we are, and that gives me pleasure to say we are 3 times larger than Argentina. Yeah, we lost the World Cup, but we can say that here. So yeah, so we are today the second largest exporter. The U.S. exports more than us, but they buy back food. We buy much less back. So that's why we are, and also interesting, very interesting, we are a very large country as the US and China and India, but we have used much less of our land to crops than the other countries. So we have much more available land to be cultivated than these very large countries, other very large countries. So we are already a powerhouse in terms of food production. We can be much bigger, right, and be much more important for the food security in the globe than we are today, and we're already pretty important. Oil. So we also produce a lot of oil. We today are the 7th largest oil exporter in the globe, but our oil production is growing. So pretty soon we'll be the 5th largest oil producer in the globe. The agencies are estimating that the Brazilian oil production will grow the second oil production that will grow the most in the next 5, 6 years. And it has been happening, right? We have been growing the production already. And this has been very important for our trade surplus, right? It's one of the biggest contributors to how much our trade surplus changed over the past years. And if we are right, I mean, if these agencies are right, I'm blaming somebody, right, already. So if these agencies are right, we are going to be our trade balance, only the oil and distillates trade balance will be contributing around $50 billion to the trade surplus. So I mean, you can see the chart on the right side. It was close to zero until recently, or negative even, and now it's moving quickly to become more and more positive, which is always good news for the currency too, right? Mining also, we are a mining powerhouse. We are the 5th largest mining jurisdiction in the globe. We are the 2nd largest iron ore producer. I think everybody knows that, but we are very important in several other important minerals. So also mining, very important. And I think this year is more an opportunity than our infrastructure is still, needs to be developed. And what we've been seeing is that in the past government, this government, it doesn't matter if it's more to the right or more to the left, all the past governments have been promoting more or making bigger concessions, infrastructure concessions to private investors. We have all the numbers in the slide. I won't say them all, but we have been every year conceding several $1 billion of future investments in transportation. This is basically transportation. I'm focusing this slide, but you can see how much money is being put into highways, railways, ports, airports. They're being either privatized or there are big concessions being done. And this government that just took office, and they the name of the program, the Brazilians know the PAC program. It doesn't matter the name at the end of the day. What matters is they are keeping the pace and coming up with new projects should be auctioned to private investors, and that can change a lot the productivity of the country.
If I take a more skeptical view of what you described, basically what I hear is that Lula has a lot of time in his hands, so not very helpful for Minister Haddad, but Minister Haddad is doing a good job, is controlling the agenda with Lira. But I think the outlook for the world has changed a bit over the past weeks. Now we spent, all of us probably spent a lot of time criticizing the Fed. Most analysts have been complaining about too little, too late, et cetera, but the big elephant in the room has been fiscal policy. And now the world has refocused on that. By the way, it was not by chance that when Biden passed his mega package, just after that, inflation started to creep up in the US. And now inflation is not falling, and people are saying, well, they hike rates, so what? What next? Well, they keep talking about spending. So it's going to be even higher next year, and higher, and you look across the world, and it's always a problem. So Haddad controls that, but no one really expects that to be sufficient to stabilize the debt. Cassiana was doing a mea culpa on forecast, but I can tell you there's one forecast you won't get wrong, is that Brazil's debt is going to go up. No one's going to get that wrong, right? Everyone expects that to happen. And you have a government with a popularity, let's say 1/3, and the governors in the southern states with popularities of 2/3. And they seem to be doing a good job. So my question to you is that the world stays like that. It's harder for countries like Brazil that are running deficits and have high debt. Do you think when push comes to shove, and it's happening now, rates are priced at 10, would the government respond and finally cut spending? Would they follow the example of the other governors that are being more prudent? Or no, we have to go to even higher rates? What's the take you think they will have as the rates tide goes up?
Center-left governments or leftist governments in the Western world, they have a logic of spending. Okay, so it's a conceptual issue. It's not something that is conjecture. It's not. The idea to spend is ingrained on the DNA of a particular type of government. Usually, and historically, the attempt to find a solution is not decreasing expenditure, but it's to increase revenue. A tax reform represents two completely opposite issues and things for the government and for society. The idea of a tax reform for society is for you to, at the end of the day, pay less. The idea of a tax reform for the government is for you, at the end of the day, to collect more. And rarely they talk about that, and rarely everyone believes that they're going to find what they want in the debate that is going on. So there's always a winner, and the winner most of the times is the government. So it's a game that it's kind of settled. So the efficiency that the government, and Brazil is a highly efficient country in collecting taxes. Compared to the rest of Latin America, Brazil is highly efficient. We all know that. Brazilians that either live in Brazil or lived before. They are efficient at that. However, there are, first, the mindset of Lula, as I mentioned in the beginning, is a mindset that does not apply to the current times. He has a mindset that is linked with his previous administration, with his last administration, in which he believes that the sole purpose of public enterprises are to catapult the capability of the government to increase the economy and to produce more, even at the expense of those very same organizations. And this is something that they're not simply doing, they believe that that's the purpose. So it's not a debate of right or wrong, it's a debate of how deep the government will use its institutions, its public institutions, to catapult the economy. Increasing the deficit is not perceived as a problem by this administration. Is not perceived as a problem by Lula, and it's not perceived as a problem by the majority of the members of the government. It is perceived moderately as a problem by the congressional leaders, is perceived moderately as a problem by Haddad, and given the dynamics, their saying is easier to succeed than Lula's saying. So perhaps the speed in which deficit will occur will be slower than what we expect. But this is a route that the government, for example, the PERSI, which is a program that the government is working on, one of the major topics in the agenda right now. In the beginning, it would reach 13 billion. That was going to be the cost of the program. So the government is already in deficit. But the Ministry of Economy is working to drop this to 5 billion. Because although they know they are already in deficit and this program will generate more deficit, they're also not going ballistic and shooting everywhere and wanting to go, okay, if we're going to spend, let's spend as if it's the last day of our lives. No, there is some sort of control in that. And this control comes through a bilateral relationship that functions between the Ministry of Economy and the Congress that does not go through the presidential palace.
If Fed is not going to be able to does not cut rates, I think that it's important to understand why. Fed is not going to cut rates because growth remains surprising to the upside. Labor market remains very tight. Then I think this is actually not negative at all for our growth story. U.S. is still the second largest trade partner of Brazil, so and definitely is something that will boost global growth. It shouldn't be negative for the markets. If you tell me that, well, the reason that they are not cutting rates is not that growth will surprise, growth will pretty much stay the same in line with forecasts, but we start to see inflation rising again between the 2.5, 3% level, and then Fed doesn't seem to be convinced that inflation is turning back to trajectory close to the 2%, then I think it's going to be a completely different reaction from the markets.
If you look back, we've seen rates talking about 12% here, policy rates at 10. We've seen much higher. Markets have priced 15, 16, and every time it happens is because of a technical reason, as you said. It turns out, for you that don't follow this closely, that the hedge fund industry in Brazil is huge. It's one of the biggest in the world. Oftentimes, they are the biggest players in EM, including US and European clients. Just a few numbers, just anecdotal. See the flow in Mexican rates, well, almost half from Brazilian hedge funds sometimes. And even global macro, they pay US rates. They were among the biggest receivers a year ago, or over a year ago. And the flip side of that is that being big and very quick on their feet, they can cause lots of dislocations in the market. So you look at their positioning today, they are expecting rates to come down. And not only in Brazil, but also in the US. When they go the other way, and you see these dislocations that we are seeing now, they create opportunities, as Guilherme was saying, as we compare pricing to what our economist Cassiano was telling us, and what I believe this is right. You can have big gaps, but they can get bigger. Now, one way or another, though, we don't know how high this can go, but this environment of higher uncertainty tends to slow down growth. People are more cautious. So one way or another, it tends to help monetary policy. But again, it's a rough ride. But I think it's very difficult to believe that rates won't be much lower if you give them enough time. One valuation that I think it stands out, and I turn to you, Carlos, is equities. Brazilian equities we've been talking about resilient growth and about the geopolitical boosts, and Brazilian equities, they haven't repriced in a long time. So is there the time as you question?
Yeah, so I think it has to do with rates naturally. I mean, the performance equities in Brazil, we think they are quite cheap. I mean, we are showing this chart to the left is the 12-month forward price earnings, and it's one standard deviation below the average. And even it's not here, but even if you compare the premium to hold equities in Brazil, so which is basically the earnings yield minus the long-term interest rates, the premium is pretty big now, which again I think it tends to come down. But not only the premium. I mean, again, we're talking about if 10% rates at the end of the year, we're talking about 6% real rates in the short term, which is too much, right? Even even if the U.S. doesn't cut, it's still a big premium to real rates here in the U.S. So I side with the comments here that rates at the end of the year should be, I don't know, maybe closer to 9.5 than 10, which would still give 5.5% real rates in the short term, which is still a lot, and it's still a big premium to U.S. rates. When it comes to equities and looking at the past cycles, every time there is a easing cycle in Brazil, equities performed better than fixed income every time. Maybe this time will be different, but if you look at the history, and we did a study earlier in the year when we look at what happened to equities performance and fixed income in the easing cycles, and we broke that down into the different sectors, trying to see which sector didn't beat the local Selic rate in easing cycles, and the answer is none. All sectors performed better than the Selic rate in monetary easing cycles. So, again, maybe this time is going to be different, but everything we are seeing would suggest that there is a good chance that equities in Brazil perform well. I know, and there is another chart which I like to show also, which is we compare the return on equity on the different markets and the price earnings multiple, and which is the chart to the right, and you see that Brazil, and maybe it's a little trickier the way we are doing it there, but if you look at Brazil, including Petrobras and Vale, it's trading at 8 times PE, which is super cheap, and the return on equity is around 18-19%. So you don't find it anywhere. You can see in the chart that there is a line, and Brazil is standing out there. So that also suggests that it's cheap. It's true that when I remove Petrobras and Vale, then it changes a little bit the analysis. I mean, we go more closer to the average. It's still interesting, but closer to the average. And one thing that I would also like to comment on that, what could trigger the Brazilian stock markets back up, earnings, right? So we've been talking here about economic activity surprising to the upside. You have 2.2% GDP growth for this year. We at Pactual, we just revised our number to 2.3, so we are moving very well. If we're not that, I wouldn't mention it. But so very close. It's surprising, yeah, we revised our GDP forecast for this year twice, only March. So, with economic activity improving and more widespread, well, last year was a lot about agribusiness, this year is more widespread. So this is when we look at the earnings that we are forecasting for Brazilian companies this year, the listed companies, right? We are seeing earnings growing 20% in nominal terms, which is a lot more than what the GDP would suggest, because the cut to interest rates, they have a powerful impact on earnings. Right, so this is also one thing that I think would probably, as it's a gradual process throughout the year, but as the quarters come and companies report better earnings, I think that will also attract attention to equities.
Fortunately, we're coming to an end. I'd like to thank you all for coming, and especially our panelists for the great presentations. Thank you.
Thank you.